December 5th, 1941. In the frozen darkness 35 kilometers west of Moscow, a German medical officer stands in the doorway of a collapsing barn, his breath crystallizing instantly in the bitter air. He has been awake for 36 hours, and his hands tremble uncontrollably, not from fear, but from a cold that has burrowed deep into his bones and refuses to leave. Before him, what remains of the 242nd Infantry Division stumbles through waist-deep snow, a ghostly procession of broken men. 6 months earlier, these same soldiers had crossed the Soviet border with flags flying and songs on their lips. 17,000 strong, farm boys from Bavaria and factory workers from the Ruhr, all confident they would be home by Christmas with stories of how they crushed the Red Army in mere weeks. Now fewer than 4,000 can still walk. Their legendary uniforms are gone, replaced by rags wrapped over stolen Russian coats, their famous jack boots disintegrating into useless leather strips. Men shuffle past on feet wrapped in newspaper and cloth, some completely barefoot, leaving bloody prints in the pristine snow as their blackened toes mark the cruel signature of frostbite. Their rifles, frozen solid and useless, have been abandoned by many. For what purpose does a weapon serve when it refuses to fire? But it is their eyes that stops the doctor's heart, empty and hollow, staring at nothing, seeing nothing. These are no longer soldiers. These are ghosts who have not yet realized they are dead. Behind them, the eastern horizon glows an ominous orange as the Soviets advance with T-34 tanks roaring through the frozen night, their engines cutting through the silence like predators closing in on wounded prey. Fresh Siberian divisions move like wolves through the forest, clad in white winter camouflage, warm, fed, and armed for this very moment. For the first time since 1939, the German army, the force that had shattered Poland in 4 weeks and brought France to its knees in 6, the machine that had conquered half of Europe with seemingly unstoppable momentum, is retreating in chaos. The doctor carries the casualty reports carved into his memory, for he had burned everything they could not carry before the retreat began. Over 800,000 German casualties in just 6 months, not all dead, though hundreds of thousands are, the rest wounded so catastrophically they will never fight again, missing and swallowed by the Russian winter, captured by the Red Army, or incapacitated by frostbite so severe their feet and hands have turned black and fallen away like dead branches. 3.8 million men had stormed into the Soviet Union on June 22nd, the largest invasion force in human history, told it would take 10 weeks, 12 at most, that the Red Army would collapse like a house built on sand. It has been 24 weeks, and the Wehrmacht is disintegrating in the snow. This is the story of Operation Barbarossa, the story of how absolute confidence became absolute catastrophe, how the most powerful military machine ever assembled was broken not by a single battle, but by hubris, miscalculation, and an enemy that refused to quit. But here is the truth most people never learn. It was not the winter that destroyed the Wehrmacht. The catastrophe was already unfolding in the summer heat, built into the plan from day one, driven by decisions made in Berlin by men who could not conceive they might be wrong. By the time the first snow fell, it was already too late. To understand how over 800,000 men became casualties in 6 months, we must return to the room where the decision was made. Berlin, December 18th, 1940, past midnight, snow falling on a city that has been at war for 16 months. Adolf Hitler stands over a massive map spread across the table in the Reich Chancellery, surrounded by his top military commanders, and his finger traces a line from Germany's eastern border deep into Soviet territory. From Warsaw to Minsk, Minsk to Smolensk, Smolensk to Moscow. And his hand does not stop at Moscow but keeps moving east, past the Volga River, toward the Urals, into the vastness of Russia itself. He tells his assembled generals that Britain will not surrender because they believe the Soviet Union will eventually enter the war against Germany. But destroy Russia and Britain's last hope dies, they will negotiate. The room falls silent as he continues, announcing they will invade the Soviet Union in spring 1941 and destroy the Red Army in a single campaign, 8 weeks, 10 at most, before autumn arrives. But this is not really about Britain. Everyone in the room knows it. This is about something Hitler has wanted since before he took power, since the 1920s when he wrote Mein Kampf in a prison cell and laid out his vision of Lebensraum, living space, Germany's destiny in the East. The conquest of Soviet territory, the destruction of what he calls Jewish Bolshevism, the enslavement and extermination of the Slavic peoples, the colonization of Eastern Europe by German settlers. Everything until now, Poland, France, the Low Countries, has been preparation for this ultimate goal. The officers around the table have conquered Europe for him with breathtaking speed. In 18 months, the Wehrmacht has crushed 6 nations with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. Poland fell in 4 weeks, Denmark in 6 hours, Norway in 2 months, the Netherlands in 5 days, Belgium in 18 days, and France, the great military power that held Germany to a stalemate for 4 years in World War I, collapsed in an almost unbelievable 6 weeks. The German military appears unstoppable, invincible, touched by some dark destiny. But Britain will not quit. The Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority over England. Operation Sea Lion has been postponed indefinitely. The Royal Navy controls the seas, and American industry is pouring weapons and supplies into Britain under Lend-Lease. Germany cannot invade Britain. Britain will not negotiate, and the war in the West has reached stalemate. Meanwhile, to the east, the Soviet Union grows stronger every month as Stalin rebuilds the Red Army, and Soviet factories produce thousands of tanks and aircraft. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the 1939 non-aggression treaty that shocked the world, was always temporary, and both sides know it. Hitler makes his calculation in that cold December room. Strike now while the Red Army is still recovering from Stalin's purges, or wait and watch the Soviets become too strong. Within days, the order goes out as Führer Directive No. 21, Case Barbarossa, explicit and unambiguous. The German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign even before the end of the war against England. Target date May 15, 1941. Objective: destroy the Red Army west of the Dnieper and Dvina rivers, prevent Soviet forces from retreating into Russia's interior, advance German lines to a boundary running from Archangel to Astrakhan, a line stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Caspian Sea. What remains of the Soviet Union beyond that line will be a broken shell incapable of resistance, ready for colonization. The planning begins immediately, and German military intelligence compiles assessments of Soviet military capability that are uniformly damning. Stalin's purges have destroyed the Red Army's leadership, they report. In 1937 and 1938, Stalin, paranoid about military coup plots, executed or imprisoned tens of thousands of Red Army officers in a bloodbath of suspicion and terror. 3 of 5 marshals executed, 13 of 15 army commanders executed, 8 of 9 admirals executed, 50 of 57 corps commanders executed, 154 of 186 division commanders executed or imprisoned. The officer corps has been decapitated, and what remains are political loyalists promoted for ideological reliability, not military competence. Yes men and survivors, not professionals. Soviet performance in the Winter War seems to prove their incompetence beyond doubt. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, a nation of 3.7 million people with an army of approximately 425,000 troops. The Finns have roughly 300,000 soldiers, obsolete equipment, and limited armor. The war should have lasted weeks, but it took the Soviets over 3 months and cost them between 126,000 to 167,000 killed and 264,000 to 321,000 wounded. The Red Army looked incompetent, sending masses of troops into Finnish defenses in human wave attacks, suffering catastrophic losses, failing to coordinate infantry and armor. If tiny Finland could inflict that kind of damage on the Soviets, German planners reason, what could Germany do with its superior training, equipment, and doctrine? German intelligence reports conclude that most Soviet tanks are inferior to German panzers. Most Soviet aircraft are outdated compared to the Luftwaffe. Soviet doctrine is primitive with its mass assaults and rigid adherence to orders, showing no flexibility. German training is superior. German officers have years of combat experience from Poland, France, and the Low Countries, and German tactics of blitzkrieg, combined armor and airstrikes, rapid encirclement, have conquered Europe. The Soviet state itself is fragile, they believe. Forced collectivization has devastated the countryside. Millions died in the famines of the early 1930s, particularly in Ukraine, and the population resents Stalin's regime. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Baltic peoples will welcome the Wehrmacht as liberators from communist oppression. The Soviet Union, German intelligence concludes with fatal confidence, is a house of cards where one strong blow and it collapses. Nearly every assessment is either wrong or catastrophically oversimplified, but no one in German high command questions them, and why would they? These conclusions confirm what Nazi ideology already teaches. Slavs are inferior, communism is weak, the Soviet Union is a rotting structure waiting to fall. In war game exercises simulating the invasion, some officers raise concerns about logistics, pointing out that the distances are enormous, over 1,000 kilometers to Moscow, and Soviet infrastructure is primitive. Can the Wehrmacht sustain an advance that deep into Russia? They are told the campaign will be over before logistics become a critical problem, 8 to 10 weeks maximum. The Red Army will be destroyed in the border regions, and after that, Soviet organized resistance evaporates. The objections are noted and dismissed with the wave of a hand. By spring 1941, the invasion plan is finalized with military precision. 3 army groups will strike simultaneously across an 1,800-kilometer front from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, with approximately 700,000 men, will drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, with approximately 1.4 million men, will smash through Belarusia toward Smolensk and then Moscow. This is the main blow, the hammer that will crush the Soviet state. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, with approximately 1.2 million men, will advance through Ukraine toward Kiev and the resource-rich Donbass industrial region. The total invasion force numbers over 3.8 million Axis troops, including German, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and other allied forces, equipped with 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. This will be the largest military operation in human history, and the strategy is Kesselschlacht, cauldron battle, where Panzer spearheads will punch deep into Soviet territory at multiple points, encircling entire Soviet armies in massive pockets, while German infantry close the encirclements and destroy the trapped forces. It is the same tactic that annihilated Polish and French armies in weeks, proven and devastating. The goal is clear: destroy the bulk of the Red Army west of the Dnieper and Dvina rivers within the first 3 to 4 weeks, before Soviet forces can retreat into Russia's vast interior. After that, the campaign becomes a pursuit and occupation operation, almost a formality. The timeline is laid out with Germanic precision. Begin in mid-May, reach the Dnieper River by mid-June, Smolensk by mid-July, Moscow by late August, victory by October, well before winter sets in. It is a plan built on speed, overwhelming force, and the absolute conviction that the enemy will break quickly, as all enemies have broken before. In April 1941, that perfect plan hits an unexpected delay. Yugoslavia's government, which had agreed to join the Axis alliance, is overthrown in a military coup on March 27th, and the new government moves toward the Allies. Hitler, furious at what he sees as betrayal and concerned about securing his southern flank before invading the Soviet Union, orders an immediate invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. The Balkans campaign is swift and brutal, another demonstration of Wehrmacht dominance. Yugoslavia falls in 11 days, Greece falls in 3 weeks, but it costs 5 critical weeks. 5 weeks that push Barbarossa's start date from May 15th to June 22nd, 1941. 5 weeks that will prove catastrophic when autumn arrives early and winter comes before Moscow falls. But in June, as over 3.8 million men assemble along the Soviet border in the greatest concentration of military power the world has ever seen, confidence is absolute. Officers study maps showing the route to Moscow, 1,000 kilometers through enemy territory, measuring distances with rulers and calculating fuel consumption. Soldiers write letters home promising they will be back by autumn in time for harvest festivals, their words filled with the casual confidence of men who have never known defeat. Tank commanders check fuel levels and ammunition counts, making final adjustments to equipment that has conquered a continent. The largest invasion in history is ready, coiled like a spring, waiting for the moment of release. On the night of June 21st, the final orders go out through the chain of command. At precisely 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa will begin with a massive artillery barrage along the entire front, a wall of fire that will announce Germany's intention to the world. In Moscow, Soviet border commanders send increasingly frantic reports to Stalin throughout June, their messages growing more urgent with each passing day. German forces are massed at the frontier. Reconnaissance indicates imminent attack. Forward positions report hearing German tank engines through the night, the smell of diesel fuel carried on the wind. Stalin dismisses the reports with irritation and suspicion. He is convinced Hitler will not attack. Not yet, not while Britain still fights. These must be provocations meant to force the Soviet Union into a military response that would give Hitler justification for war. He orders his commanders not to take any action that might provoke the Germans. No full mobilization, no forward defensive positions, do not respond to provocations, wait for orders from Moscow. At 3:14 a.m. on June 22nd, German artillery crews stand ready along the entire 1,800-kilometer front. Gunners with coordinates locked in, forward observers checking their watches and counting down the final seconds in whispered voices. At 3:15 a.m., the world changes forever. 3,000 artillery pieces fire as one in a symphony of destruction. The flash can be seen from space. A line of fire 1,800 kilometers long, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The sound is not just heard but felt. The ground trembles, windows shatter in villages 40 kilometers from the border, and Soviet guard posts vanish in the first seconds. Barracks explode into flames, communication stations are obliterated before a single warning can be sent. Entire towns along the frontier erupt in fire and smoke. At a Soviet observation post near the Bug River, a young lieutenant is writing in his log when the world explodes around him. The bunker collapses, and he crawls out through rubble, ears ringing, bleeding from shrapnel wounds he does not yet feel. Outside, the forest is on fire, the sky is orange with reflected flames, and he tries to reach headquarters on the field telephone, but the line is dead. He tries the radio and hears only static. Then he hears them. Engines, hundreds of engines growing louder with each passing second. The panzers are coming. The bombardment lasts 90 minutes of sustained hell, and when it stops, the silence lasts exactly 30 seconds before the real assault begins. Panzer Group 2, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, 630 tanks strong, crashes through the Soviet lines south of Brest like a metal fist. Panzer Group 3 under General Hermann Hoth, 840 tanks, smashes through near Grodno to the north. They are not advancing in lines but driving in concentrated columns, armored fists punching deep into Soviet territory, Panzer IIIs and IVs with turrets traversing, main guns firing at bunkers, strong points, anything that moves. Behind them roll motorized infantry in trucks and half-tracks, and behind them march regular infantry divisions at forced pace. This is blitzkrieg at its absolute peak. Speed, violence, shock, overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Above, the Luftwaffe rules unchallenged in skies that should be contested but are eerily empty. At Soviet airfields across the border region, aircraft sit parked in neat rows, wings almost touching, perfect targets laid out as if for an exercise. Pilots are asleep in barracks. Ground crews have not been mobilized. No one received orders to disperse the planes or scramble fighters because Stalin would not believe war was imminent. Stukas and Heinkel bombers arrive at dawn like harbingers of doom. They do not face anti-aircraft fire. They do not face interceptors. They simply line up and drop their bombs with methodical precision. Soviet fighters and bombers explode on the ground in great gouts of flame. Fuel tanks ignite, turning entire airfields into firestorms that consume everything. Pilots run onto the tarmac in their underwear and watch helplessly as their aircraft burn, years of training reduced to ash in minutes. At one field near Minsk, the commander of the Soviet Western Front's bomber aviation, stands among the wreckage of his command, surveying the complete destruction of his air force. 48 hours later, he will write a report to Moscow detailing the losses with shaking hands, then walk into his office and shoot himself, unable to bear the weight of such catastrophic failure. By the end of the first day, June 22, 1941, the Luftwaffe destroys 1,200 Soviet aircraft. Though the actual number may be higher, as Soviet records are chaotic and incomplete, consumed in the same fires that destroyed the planes. The Red Air Force loses air superiority in 24 hours, a defeat so complete it seems almost impossible. On the ground, chaos is total and all-consuming. At Western Front headquarters in Minsk, the commanding general receives reports that make no sense, that contradict each other, that paint a picture of disaster so complete he cannot process it. Germans attacking at the border, expected and prepared for. Germans already 50 kilometers deep, impossible. The border is defended. Germans reported simultaneously in 6 different sectors. How can this be? Communications collapse faster than anyone thought possible. Radio nets are jammed or destroyed by precision strikes. Telephone lines are cut by artillery or by German special forces who cross the border hours before the invasion, moving like ghosts through the darkness. Messengers are sent with orders and never return, killed by airstrikes or overrun by advancing panzers that move faster than anyone believed tanks could move. The general tries to reach Moscow, and the line finally connects at 4:30 a.m., more than an hour after the invasion began. He reports that the Germans have invaded in force across the entire front, his voice urgent, seeking orders, seeking permission to respond with the full weight of Soviet forces. The response from Moscow is stunning in its inadequacy. Do not panic, do not give in to provocation. The matter is being reported to Comrade Stalin. Wait for orders. He asks for permission to mobilize reserves and order a general retreat to prepare defensive lines before the situation becomes irretrievable. Wait for orders from Moscow, comes the reply, and the call ends, leaving him staring at a dead telephone in disbelief. Stalin does not issue coherent orders until 7:15 a.m., 4 hours after the invasion began, 4 hours during which the Wehrmacht has driven deep into Soviet territory and destroyed much of the forward defense. When the orders finally come, they are worse than useless, a product of Stalin's refusal to accept reality. Soviet forces are ordered to attack the invading Germans and destroy enemy forces, but not to cross the border into German territory. Commanders read the orders in disbelief, their hands trembling with frustration and fear. Attack with what? Half their units are encircled or destroyed, scattered across a chaotic battlefield. The rest have no air cover, no clear picture of where the enemy is, no supplies moving forward because the roads are clogged with refugees and burning vehicles. But orders are orders, especially Stalin's orders, and to disobey is to invite execution. Soviet counterattacks go forward with desperate courage and are slaughtered with mechanical efficiency. Near Grodno, the Soviet 6th Mechanized Corps, over 1,000 tanks, launches a counterattack against Hoth's Panzer Group 3. On paper, this should be devastating. The Soviets have numerical superiority, but the tanks are a mix of obsolete models and newer T-34s and KV-1s that crews barely know how to operate, having received them just weeks before. There is no reconnaissance, no air support, no coordination with infantry, just orders to attack and restore the border. They drive straight into German positions that are prepared and waiting. German Panzerabwehrs, dug into hull-down positions on ridges, fire down into the advancing Soviet armor with deadly accuracy. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, repositioned as anti-tank weapons, tear through Soviet tanks at 1,000 meters. And Stukas dive from above with their sirens screaming, dropping bombs directly onto tank columns that have no air cover. The Soviet 6th Mechanized Corps is annihilated in 3 days. Over 1,000 tanks destroyed or abandoned, burning hulks littering the battlefield like monuments to futility. The Corps ceases to exist as a fighting force, its name struck from the order of battle. This pattern repeats across the front with soul-crushing regularity. Soviet units attack without coordination, thrown piecemeal into battle against an enemy that operates like a well-oiled machine, and German forces destroy them in detail, one unit at a time, with the cold efficiency of an industrial process. But not everywhere do the Soviets collapse so quickly. At the fortress of Brest, right on the Bug River, where German forces crossed in the first minutes of the invasion, the German 45th Infantry Division expects to take the position in hours. The fortress is old 19th century construction, and its garrison of approximately 9,000 Soviet troops, border guards, NKVD units, and some military families should surrender quickly when faced with overwhelming force. They do not. German infantry assaults the fortress walls under artillery cover, and Soviet defenders fire from embrasures, from rooftops, from rubble, refusing to yield. German flamethrower teams burn out bunkers with liquid fire, and Soviet soldiers retreat to interior positions and keep fighting, falling back room by room but never giving up. The battle for Brest lasts a week of unimaginable intensity, room to room, floor to floor, bunker to bunker, a miniature Stalingrad before Stalingrad exists. German combat engineers have to blast through walls with explosives, collapse buildings on defenders who refuse to surrender, and eventually use poison gas in the underground sections where Soviet soldiers have retreated to continue the fight. The last Soviet defenders, down to a handful of men with no ammunition, no water, no hope, scratch messages on the fortress walls in the final days with whatever they can find: blood, charcoal, their fingernails. One reads simply, "I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, Motherland." July 20th, 1941, nearly a month after the invasion began. The soldier who wrote it, name unknown, was buried when the Germans dynamited his position, entombed forever in his own memorial. Brest is an exception to the pattern of swift German victories, but it reveals something German intelligence did not predict and cannot understand. These soldiers fight differently than the Poles or French. They do not quit when the situation becomes hopeless. They do not calculate odds and surrender when defeat is inevitable. They fight until they die, and this changes everything. By June 28th, just 6 days into the invasion, Army Group Center's two panzer groups have driven over 300 kilometers into Soviet territory with breathtaking speed. Guderian's Panzer Group 2, advancing from the south, takes the city of Slonim, while Hoth's Panzer Group 3, driving from the north, captures Molodechno. Between them lies the city of Minsk, and between the German border and Minsk are trapped several entire Soviet armies, the 3rd, 4th, and 10th armies, over 400,000 men caught in a pocket that is closing like a steel trap. On June 29th, Guderian and Hoth's spearheads link up east of Minsk in a moment of triumph captured by war correspondents. The trap closes with mechanical precision. 400,000 Soviet soldiers are encircled, 15 rifle divisions, 6 tank divisions, elements of 4 mechanized corps, all cut off from supply, with no air support and no escape route. Soviet commanders order breakout attempts with desperate urgency, and columns of men and vehicles try to smash through German lines at night, moving through darkness in the hope of avoiding the Luftwaffe. Some small groups succeed, slipping through gaps in the chaos, vanishing into the forest to continue fighting as partisans, or to make the long walk home. Most do not succeed. German infantry divisions move up to seal the pocket completely, artillery pounds Soviet positions day and night, and the Luftwaffe attacks anything that moves inside the encirclement with systematic thoroughness. Soldiers run out of ammunition, then food, then water, dying slowly under the summer sun. By mid-July, the Minsk pocket is liquidated with brutal efficiency. German forces take over 290,000 prisoners who shuffle westward in endless columns, hands raised, eyes empty. Another 70,000 Soviet soldiers are dead, their bodies left where they fell. The rest escaped into the forest or are unaccounted for, likely dead in the woods or dying of wounds, buried in unmarked graves that will never be found. It is the largest encirclement in military history up to that point, and German newsreels bring the images to the world in a propaganda triumph. Endless columns of Soviet prisoners of war shuffling westward under guard, captured Soviet tanks and artillery abandoned along roadsides like discarded toys, German soldiers posing in front of Red Army banners with grins of victory. The Soviet Union appears to be collapsing exactly as Hitler predicted, exactly as Nazi ideology said it must. In the north, Army Group North smashes through Lithuania and Latvia with similar speed and success. Riga falls on July 1st, and by mid-July, German forces are approaching the outskirts of Leningrad, 900 kilometers from where they started, an advance that seems almost miraculous in its speed. In the south, Army Group South advances more slowly, as Soviet resistance is better organized there, and the terrain, crossed by rivers and marshes, slows the panzers and disrupts the carefully planned timetables. But it is still an advance, still forward momentum, still apparent victory. By early July, German forces are driving toward Kiev, and the city seems within reach. The numbers by mid-July are staggering and seem to prove the correctness of German planning. Over 600,000 Soviet prisoners of war taken, over 1,500 Soviet aircraft destroyed, thousands of Soviet tanks and artillery pieces captured or destroyed, and German forces have penetrated 400 to 500 kilometers into Soviet territory in just 3 weeks. In Berlin, victory seems certain, inevitable, merely a matter of time. Officers at OKH, Army High Command, begin planning occupation zones and resource extraction, drawing lines on maps to divide the conquered territories. Hitler tells his inner circle that the Soviet state is finished. Stalin will either surrender or be overthrown by his own people who will welcome German liberation. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels writes in his diary with satisfaction, "The Führer estimates the campaign will be over in 4 weeks. Everything is going according to plan." Except it is not going according to plan. Not really. The problems are small at first, easy to dismiss in the flood of victories that dominate the headlines and fill the newsreels. Soviet units that should surrender when encircled instead fight until they are annihilated, forcing the Germans to expend time, ammunition, and lives to eliminate pockets that should have collapsed. Encircled forces break into small groups and continue fighting behind German lines, attacking supply convoys, ambushing messengers, sabotaging rail lines, creating chaos far behind the front. This is not how defeated armies behave. This is not what happened in France or Poland. German supply units report increasing attacks from Soviet stragglers and partisans with growing concern. A convoy is ambushed on the road to Minsk. 12 trucks burned, 34 soldiers killed. A fuel depot is blown up by Soviet demolition teams that slipped through the front lines in the confusion. A German battalion commander is found dead on a road he thought was secure, shot by a sniper who vanished into the forest. These are small incidents, barely worth mentioning in reports. But they accumulate, they persist, they create a growing sense of unease, and the distances are starting to matter in ways the planners did not fully appreciate. German supply lines now stretch 300, 400, 500 kilometers from the railheads to the front, and every kilometer adds friction, delay, vulnerability. Soviet railways use a wider gauge than European railways, a seemingly minor detail that becomes a major obstacle. Every supply train stops at the border while engineers change the axles or transfer cargo to compatible rolling stock, and the process takes hours, sometimes days, creating bottlenecks that slow everything down. The roads are worse than intelligence predicted, far worse. These are not the paved highways of France, but dirt tracks that turn to liquid mud after summer rainstorms, and trucks bogged down in the muck. Traffic jams form that stretch for kilometers, and a panzer division waiting for fuel cannot advance. An infantry division waiting for ammunition cannot attack, and the tanks are breaking down at alarming rates. German panzers were designed for European roads and European distances, for campaigns measured in hundreds of kilometers over a few weeks. Russia has neither European roads nor European distances. Transmissions fail from overuse, engines overheat in the summer heat, tracks throw under the strain of constant operation, and suspensions break on rough terrain that was never anticipated in the design process. By mid-July, 30% of German armored vehicles are non-operational due to mechanical failure. Not combat losses, but simple breakdowns, wear and tear that accumulates faster than it can be repaired. Spare parts have to come from Germany, and that is 1,500 kilometers away through the supply bottleneck. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the Red Army is not collapsing as predicted. Soviet forces are being destroyed in the border regions. Yes, the encirclements are real, the casualty figures are accurate, But fresh divisions keep appearing like ghosts materializing from the vast Russian interior. Pulled from the interior, mobilized from reserves, stripped from the Far East where they had been watching the Japanese border, these new divisions are poorly trained, barely equipped, often thrown into battle within days of formation. But they are there, filling gaps, contesting advances, refusing to accept defeat. At Smolensk, 400 kilometers east of Minsk, the Soviets establish a new defensive line in mid-July. An Army Group Center attacks expecting another quick encirclement and victory. Another encirclement does form, 300,000 more Soviet troops trapped, but this time the pocket does not collapse quickly as the Minsk pocket did. Soviet forces inside launch breakout attempts with desperate ferocity. Soviet forces outside launch relief attacks trying to break through to their encircled comrades, and the fighting drags on day after day. Days become weeks, and German officers who expected Smolensk to fall in a week watch in frustration as it takes 2 months to fully reduce the pocket. 2 months while Moscow fortifies its defenses with every hour that passes. 2 months while Soviet factories evacuate east beyond German reach, dismantled and loaded onto trains to be reassembled beyond the Urals. 2 months while autumn approaches with its promise of mud and cold. Hitler's generals see the problem clearly and urge him with increasing desperation to drive for Moscow immediately. Smolensk is 400 kilometers from the capital, they argue. The road is open. The Soviet defenses between here and Moscow are weak, hastily constructed, undermanned. Strike before the Soviets can dig in, before the weather changes, before the window closes completely. But Hitler makes a different calculation, one that will decide the fate of the entire campaign and alter the course of history. August 4th, 1941, Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Hitler's field headquarters hidden in the forest. The map room is tense with unspoken conflict. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, stands at the map table pointing emphatically to Moscow, his voice tight with urgency. Around him stand Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, General Heinz Guderian, just flown in from Panzer Group 2, and other senior commanders summoned from the front for this critical meeting. They have come to convince Hitler of one thing: drive for Moscow now, immediately, without delay. Halder lays out the argument with military precision. Army Group Center is 400 kilometers from Moscow, he says, tracing the route on the map. The road from Smolensk to the capital is open. Soviet defenses between here and Moscow are weak, hastily constructed, undermanned by forces that have been bled white in the border battles. The panzers can reach the city in 3 weeks, 4 at most, before autumn rains begin. Moscow is not just a city, he emphasizes, tapping the map for emphasis. It is the nerve center of the entire Soviet state. Stalin's government is there. The railway hub connecting the entire Western Soviet Union runs through it. Soviet command and control depends on Moscow's communication networks. 7 major rail lines converge there, like spokes on a wheel. Take Moscow and the Soviet Union is decapitated. The state might collapse completely. Soviet ability to coordinate resistance across the front dies. And most urgently, autumn is 8 weeks away, maybe less. Every day wasted is a day closer to mud, rain, cold, the closing of the operational window. Strike now while victory is still possible. Hitler listens in silence, and he has been listening to this argument for 2 weeks from Halder, from Brauchitsch, from Bach, who commands Army Group Center, and has sent increasingly urgent messages from the front. When Halder finishes his presentation, Hitler shakes his head slowly, and his decision will echo through history. Moscow can wait, he says with finality. He points to the map, not at Moscow, but south toward Ukraine. Here, he says, this is what matters now. Ukraine holds the resources Germany needs for a long war, the industrial capacity of the Donbass region with its coal mines and steel mills, the grain fields that feed the Soviet Union, the oil fields further south in the Caucasus that fuel the Red Army. More immediately, he continues, a massive Soviet force of over 600,000 men is concentrated around Kiev, threatening Army Group South's flank, a dagger pointed at the entire southern wing of the invasion. Hitler's decision is both strategic and ideological, driven by his vision of how the war must be fought. Germany needs Ukraine's resources for the long war he can now see coming. The Soviet forces at Kiev must be destroyed before they can threaten the entire operation. Only then can the Wehrmacht drive for Moscow with secure flanks, with the confidence that no massive Soviet army can strike from the south, while German forces are committed to taking the capital. His generals argue back carefully, treading the dangerous line between military advice and contradicting the Führer, which has become increasingly perilous. Guderian speaks with the bluntness of a frontline commander who sees the operational realities every day. My Führer, we can take Moscow before the weather changes. We have the momentum. The forces are positioned. The enemy is reeling. Once Moscow falls, Kiev will be isolated anyway, cut off from command and control. The Soviet forces there will collapse without orders, without hope, without leadership. Hitler cuts him off with a sharp gesture, his voice hardening with irritation. The Soviet forces at Kiev will not collapse, he says. They will attack Army Group South's flank while we are driving for Moscow, and we will be fighting a two-front battle in the center while winter approaches, spread thin, vulnerable, defeated in detail. Halder tries again, his voice more urgent now, sensing the moment slipping away. Moscow is the strategic objective. Everything else is secondary. The entire German general staff agrees on this point. Hitler's voice becomes steel, brooking no further argument. I will not have my southern flank threatened, he says with finality. The panzers turn south, destroy the Soviet forces at Kiev, eliminate the threat completely. Then, and only then, we advance on Moscow with our flanks secure. The meeting ends in silence heavy with unspoken disagreement. Guderian leaves the room knowing with terrible certainty that the campaign has just been lost, that the window for victory is closing while they debate, that history is turning on this moment. He does not say it out loud, not yet, not where it can be reported, but he writes in his diary that night with a hand that shakes slightly. This is the decision that will cost us the war in the East. On August 21st, Panzer Groups 2 and 3, the armored spearheads of Army Group Center that had been poised to drive on Moscow, received their orders with disbelief and frustration. Turn south, drive for Kiev, destroy the Soviet armies there, and only then will Moscow be reconsidered. The Kiev encirclement that follows is a tactical masterpiece, a demonstration of Wehrmacht operational brilliance that will be studied in military academies for generations. Guderian's Panzer Group 2 drives south from Smolensk in a great sweeping arc, while Panzer Group 1 from Army Group South, commanded by General Ewald von Kleist, drives north from the Dnieper River. The two armored pincers close like the jaws of a trap. On September 14th, they link up east of Kiev, and the pocket that forms contains 665,000 Soviet soldiers. The Southwestern Front, 5 entire armies trapped in the largest encirclement in military history. Soviet commanders inside the pocket beg Moscow for permission to retreat before the encirclement closes completely. Their message is increasingly desperate as they watch the trap forming. Marshal Semyon Budyonny, commanding the southwestern direction, sends frantic telegrams to Stalin that become more urgent with each hour. We must withdraw or the front will be annihilated, he pleads. We can save the armies if we move now, but in hours it will be too late. Stalin's response arrives with the cold certainty of a man who cannot accept reality. Hold Kiev, not one step back, the city will not be surrendered. On September 11th, 3 days before the pocket closes completely, the Soviet Chief of Staff in the Kiev sector, General Mikhail Kirponos, receives orders directly from Stalin that seal his fate. Encirclement is not possible. The message reads, you will hold your positions, fight where you stand. Kirponos obeys because he is a loyal officer and because to disobey Stalin is to invite execution, not just for himself, but for his family. He holds. On September 16th, with German forces tightening the noose methodically, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting, Kirponos finally receives permission to attempt a breakout, but the permission comes too late, far too late. His forces are surrounded, out of ammunition, being hammered by German artillery that fires with mechanical precision and airstrikes that come in waves throughout the day. Kirponos is killed on September 20th while trying to break through German lines. shot by a machine gun burst while leading his men forward in a desperate final attempt to escape. His body is found days later, identified by the documents in his pocket. By September 26th, the Kiev pocket is eliminated with thoroughness that shocks even German commanders. 665,000 Soviet prisoners, the largest encirclement in military history, a number so large it seems almost abstract. Thousands more lie dead in the fields around Kiev, and mountains of captured equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, supplies, fill the inventory reports. German newsreels show the scale of the victory to a world that watches in amazement. Columns of Soviet prisoners of war stretching to the horizon, so many men that it takes days for them all to pass. Captured Soviet generals being interrogated, maps showing the enormity of the encirclement. Hitler's decision appears vindicated, the generals who argued for Moscow appear to have been wrong, and the Führer's strategic vision seems proven correct. But look at the calendar with clear eyes and understand what has been traded for this tactical victory. The Kiev operation began on August 21st and ended on September 26th. 5 weeks of operations focused on the south instead of Moscow. 5 weeks while Army Group Center sat idle at Smolensk, its panzers gone, its infantry waiting, its momentum lost, watching the calendar pages turn. 5 weeks while Moscow fortified with desperate energy, while Soviet workers, men, women, teenagers, dug anti-tank ditches around the capital in 3 defensive lines, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, excavating trenches, building bunkers, laying minefields with their bare hands. 5 weeks while Stalin mobilized more divisions from Siberia and Central Asia, pulling every reserve he could find, stripping garrison forces from regions that had been quiet, throwing everything into the defense of the capital. 5 weeks while autumn approached with its inevitable rains and mud. When Guderian's panzers returned to Army Group Center in late September, ready to resume the drive on Moscow after their victory at Kiev, the window has narrowed to a crack. Autumn rains are due in early October. Everyone knows this. It is as predictable as the sunrise. That means Rasputitsa, the season of mud, when the dirt roads of Russia become impassable rivers of liquid earth. Once the mud comes, movement becomes nearly impossible. Vehicles bog down, supply convoys halt, offensive operations become a fantasy. The ground has to freeze solid before armored operations can resume. That gives the Wehrmacht maybe 3 weeks to reach Moscow, 4 if they are extraordinarily lucky with the weather. The generals know it with sick certainty, and some say it openly in meetings, their voices tight with frustration. This cannot be done. Not in the time remaining, not with the forces available stretched as thin as they are, not with supply lines already at the breaking point. But Hitler orders the attack anyway, unwilling to accept that the operational window has closed, unable to conceive that his decisions might have cost Germany the war. Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, the last great offensive of 1941. Launch date, October 2nd, 1941. Army Group Center assembles the largest concentration of force the Wehrmacht has ever fielded in a single operation, scraping together every available unit. 78 divisions, 1 million men, over 700 tanks, 14,000 guns and mortars, 1,000 aircraft. 3 panzer groups will strike simultaneously from different directions, encircling Soviet forces west of Moscow in one final decisive Kesselschlacht that will end the war in the east. The plan is brilliant on paper, a masterpiece of operational art, and in execution it starts well, better than anyone dared hope. October the 2nd, the offensive begins with the now familiar thunder of artillery and the roar of tank engines. German panzers smash through Soviet defensive lines in multiple sectors, exploiting gaps with the skill born of 2 years of constant victory. Within days, 2 massive encirclements form, one at Vyazma and one at Bryansk, classic Wehrmacht cauldron battles executed with precision. Trapped inside these pockets are 673,000 Soviet soldiers, armies that cease to exist in the space of a week. German forward units race east, driving for Moscow with desperate speed, and by October 10th, advanced reconnaissance elements are within 80 kilometers of the capital, close enough to see the city on clear days. The capital seems within reach, Victory seems possible again. The momentum that was lost at Kiev appears to have returned. In Moscow, panic sets in like a contagion. Government ministries evacuate east to Kuibyshev, 900 kilometers away, trains packed with officials and documents. Foreign diplomats flee, their embassies closing in haste. Railway stations are mobbed by civilians desperate to escape the approaching Germans, fighting for space on trains, crushing each other in their fear. Looting breaks out in some districts as order begins to break down, and NKVD troops restore order by shooting looters in the streets, their bodies left as warnings. For 3 days it looks like Moscow will fall, like Hitler's gamble has paid off, like the war will end with German victory after all. Then on October 7th, the sky opens up, and everything changes. Rain, not drizzle, not passing showers, but torrential freezing rain that falls for days without stopping, as if the heavens have opened to drown the German advance. The dirt roads of Western Russia, the same roads German supply columns and panzer divisions have been using for 4 months, wearing them down to bare earth, turn to liquid mud in hours. Not the mud of Europe, not the mud German soldiers have seen in France or Poland, but something else entirely, something that seems almost alive in its ability to swallow vehicles. Glutinous, bottomless, the consistency of wet concrete. Vehicles do not get stuck in this mud, they disappear. Trucks sink to their axles within minutes, then to their doors, then the mud reaches the windows, and still the vehicles sink. Tanks bog down, their tracks spinning uselessly, digging themselves deeper with every revolution. Horses collapse, trying to pull wagons through the muck, their legs giving out under the impossible strain. A single truck getting stuck blocks entire convoys, and traffic jams stretch for kilometers behind it. Hundreds of vehicles immobilized, vulnerable, useless. Infantry trying to march forward sink knee-deep with every step, exhausting themselves covering a few hundred meters in an hour, arriving at their objectives too tired to fight. The offensive does not slow, it stops completely, as if someone has thrown a switch. German soldiers stand in freezing rain that soaks through their uniforms, watching their vehicles sink into the earth, unable to move forward or back, trapped in place by forces beyond their control. Supply convoys that should take 6 hours to reach the front now take 3 days if they arrive at all. More often, they get stuck somewhere on roads that have become rivers of mud, abandoned by exhausted drivers who walk forward on foot. Fuel does not reach the panzers, which sit immobilized not by enemy action, but by empty tanks. Ammunition does not reach the artillery, which falls silent. Food does not reach the infantry, who begin to starve inside of Moscow. And the Soviets use the pause with desperate effectiveness. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, pulled from the Leningrad front, where he has been organizing that city's defense, takes command of Moscow's defense on October 10th, arriving by plane in the midst of the panic. He is 44 years old, blunt, ruthless, brutally competent, and utterly without illusions about the situation he faces. He organizes worker battalions to dig more anti-tank ditches, deeper, wider, more extensive. He positions what remains of the Soviet Western Front's forces into 3 defensive lines west of Moscow, thin but determined. He brings Siberian divisions west on trains that run day and night, troops trained and equipped for winter warfare, wearing quilted jackets and felt boots that will function when temperatures drop. Men who have trained in conditions worse than this. He tells his officers with cold clarity, "We hold until the ground freezes, then we make them pay for every meter they advance. We trade space for time and blood for survival." By early November, the mud begins to freeze as temperatures drop, first to 0, then below. The transition from autumn to winter coming with brutal speed. The ground hardens, becoming solid again, and movement becomes possible for the first time in weeks. The German advance resumes on November 15th with the desperation of men who know this is their last chance. But now the soldiers are facing something else, something they are utterly unprepared for. Russian winter. No winter clothing has been issued to the Wehrmacht, not because of oversight or incompetence, but because the plan said the campaign would be over by October, the troops would be in winter quarters in Moscow, Leningrad, Ukraine before the cold came. There would be no need for winter equipment. But it is November. The campaign is not over. Moscow has not fallen. and German soldiers are still wearing the same uniforms they crossed the border in 5 months ago. Thin cotton designed for summer and early autumn. When the temperature drops to minus 20 degrees Celsius in mid-November, the suffering is immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers wrap themselves in anything they can find. Stolen Soviet coats taken from prisoners or corpses, blankets wound around their bodies, newspapers stuffed under uniforms for insulation. But it is not enough, nowhere near enough. Frostbite appears within days of the temperature dropping, spreading through the ranks like a plague. Fingers turn white, then gray, then black as the tissue dies. Toes follow the same progression, hidden in boots until men take them off and find their feet have turned to dead meat. Ears, noses, cheeks. Any exposed skin succumbs to the cold. Men lose extremities to cold, not to combat, more casualties from the weather than from Soviet bullets. The equipment fails in ways that seem almost malicious. Tank engines will not start. The oil has frozen solid overnight, becoming a thick gel that will not flow. Soldiers build fires under the engines to warm them, trying to thaw the oil enough to start the tanks, and sometimes it works. Sometimes the tank catches fire and burns. Sometimes the engine is so cold that starting it cracks the engine block and destroys the tank permanently. Vehicle batteries die in the cold, drained of power in hours. Radios do not work, their electronics frozen, leaving units unable to communicate. Machine guns fire 3 rounds and jam, the mechanism seized by cold. Mortars shatter when fired, the metal made brittle by extreme cold, exploding and killing their own crews. German soldiers watch Soviet troops moving in winter gear and functioning equipment, and they realize with growing despair the terrible truth. The enemy is ready for this. They are built for this war. Their equipment works. Their clothing keeps them alive. And we are not ready. We are dying. We are losing. By late November, German forces reach the closest point they will ever get to the Soviet capital, the high water mark of the invasion. Advance units of the 258th Infantry Division reach Khimki, a town just 15 kilometers from the Kremlin, so close they can see the city. German officers with binoculars can see Moscow's anti-aircraft searchlights sweeping the night sky, can see the spires of the capital gleaming in the winter sun, can almost touch their objective, so close, impossibly close, but they cannot advance further, not 1 meter more. They are out of fuel, their tanks are empty. Out of ammunition, having fired everything in the drive forward, freezing, losing men to cold every hour, starving the supply convoys unable to reach them through the mud and snow, exhausted, having fought continuously for 5 months without rest. And on December 5, 1941, while German forces cling desperately to their forward positions, barely surviving, the Soviets counterattack. December 5, 1941, in a destroyed Russian farmhouse 40 kilometers west of Moscow, a German infantry officer is trying to sleep when he hears it. Artillery, distant at first, then closer, hundreds of guns firing in sequence. The sound rolls across the frozen landscape like continuous thunder that never stops, growing louder with each passing minute. He has been on the Eastern Front since June. He knows what Soviet artillery sounds like. But this is different, heavier than anything he has heard since the campaign began. Then he hears something else beneath the artillery. Engines, tank engines, dozens of them, hundreds growing louder, approaching from the east. He stumbles outside into minus 35-degree darkness, his breath freezing instantly, and other soldiers are emerging from buildings, from foxholes, from wherever they have found shelter from the wind that cuts like knives. Someone shouts that the Russians are attacking, but this makes no sense. The Russians are supposed to be finished, broken, clinging to Moscow and waiting for the final German assault. But they are attacking with overwhelming force. 100 Soviet divisions, over 1 million men, launched simultaneous assaults along a 600-kilometer front around Moscow, emerging from positions that German intelligence insisted did not exist. These are not the half-trained, poorly equipped conscripts the Wehrmacht has been fighting for months. These are Siberian divisions pulled from the Far East, troops who have been training in conditions worse than this, who consider minus 30 degrees normal weather, wearing proper winter uniforms, quilted jackets, fur-lined boots, white camouflage smocks that make them invisible in the snow. Equipped with weapons that function in extreme cold, tanks whose engines start, rifles that fire, mortars that do not shatter. They have been moving into position for 2 weeks while German reconnaissance, blinded by snow and lacking fuel for patrols, missed them completely. Now they strike with the force of an avalanche. T-34 tanks, their wide tracks gripping frozen ground where German panzers are immobilized, unable to move, smash through German defensive positions that are little more than scraped-out holes in the frozen earth. Soviet ski troops, moving through forests that are impossible for German vehicles, appear behind German lines like ghosts, cutting supply routes, overrunning headquarters, spreading chaos. Cossack cavalry charges hit exposed German flanks, something from another century but terrifyingly effective against soldiers who cannot move in the deep snow. The Wehrmacht has never seen anything like this, has never faced an enemy that is stronger in winter than in summer, that uses the cold as a weapon. At Klin, north of Moscow, the Soviet 31st Army breaks through German lines and drives 50 kilometers in 3 days, a penetration that threatens to cut off entire German armies. At Tula, south of the capital, Soviet forces encircled German units that had been preparing to complete the encirclement of Moscow, and the hunter becomes the hunted in a cruel reversal. The German defensive response is chaos, pure, uncoordinated chaos. Units that have been attacking for 5 months, always advancing, always on the offensive, driving the enemy before them, suddenly have to defend, and they do not know how. But defend what? Defend where? The front line is fluid, non-existent in places. Soviet breakthrough groups are everywhere, behind German lines, on the flanks, cutting communications. Officers try to organize defensive positions, but the frozen ground is too hard to dig. Entrenching tools bounce off earth that is frozen solid as concrete. Soldiers pile snow and corpses to build firing positions, using the dead as sandbags, and this becomes normal, acceptable, the only option available. And the cold is killing as surely as Soviet bullets, perhaps more surely. By early December, nighttime temperatures are dropping to minus 40 degrees Celsius, temperatures at which exposed skin freezes in minutes. Daytime temperatures barely reach minus 30, offering no relief, no warmth, no respite. German soldiers are still wearing summer uniforms with whatever they have scavenged layered on top. Stolen Russian coats, blankets, newspapers, anything that might provide insulation. It is not enough, nowhere near enough, and men die. Men die in their sleep. Their body temperature drops during the night. Hypothermia sets in silently, and they never wake up. Found frozen in the morning by their comrades. Sentries freeze to death at their post. Found standing upright, rifles in hand, frozen solid where they stood, ice statues of men who were alive hours before. Frostbite becomes epidemic, not minor cases that heal, but catastrophic tissue death that destroys lives. Fingers, toes, feet, hands turn black and die, the flesh rotting while still attached to living bodies. Field hospitals are overwhelmed with frostbite casualties, more men arriving with frozen extremities than with combat wounds. Surgeons amputate frozen limbs without anesthesia because supplies ran out weeks ago and nothing is reaching the front, and the screaming can be heard across entire encampments, the sound of men losing pieces of themselves to the cold. More men are being evacuated for frostbite than for combat wounds, and this is how armies die, not in battle but in slow attrition, and the equipment is failing completely, a total systems collapse. Tanks will not start no matter what soldiers try, the engines frozen beyond recovery. Soldiers light fires under the engines, trying to warm the oil enough to flow, and sometimes it works for a few precious minutes. Sometimes the tank catches fire and burns, adding smoke to the winter sky. Sometimes the engine is so cold that starting it cracks the engine block, and the tank is destroyed without the enemy firing a shot. Vehicle batteries die in the cold, drained of all power in hours. Radios do not work, their circuits frozen, their batteries dead, leaving units isolated and alone. Machine guns fire 3 rounds and jam solid, the mechanism seized by cold metal, freezing to metal. Mortars shatter when fired, the tubes made brittle by extreme cold, exploding and killing their own crews in bursts of shrapnel. German soldiers watch Soviet equipment function normally in the same conditions, watch Soviet tanks start and move, Soviet weapons fire, Soviet radios work, and they realize with despair that crushes morale. The enemy is built for this war, designed for these conditions, and we are not. We are dying. We have already lost. By December 10th, the Wehrmacht is retreating along the entire front around Moscow, and this is not an orderly withdrawal with rear guards in planned positions. This is a rout, a collapse, a disintegration of military order. Units break apart like ice under pressure. Officers lose contact with their men. Radios do not work. Messengers do not return. And suddenly commanders are alone with a handful of soldiers and no idea where the rest of their command has gone. Soldiers flee westward in small groups, no longer organized units, but bands of survivors trying to stay ahead of Soviet pursuit, trying to reach safety that keeps receding before them. They abandon equipment they cannot move, everything that slows them down. Vehicles out of fuel are left on the roads. Artillery pieces are spiked and abandoned. Supplies are burned or left for the enemy. Entire convoys are left on the roads, frozen solid, out of fuel, out of hope, monuments to logistical failure. The roads west become nightmares that will haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Columns of retreating Germans mix with supply convoys, trying to move forward in confusion that defies description. And traffic jams form that stretch for dozens of kilometers, perfect targets. Soviet aircraft strafe the jams with methodical precision, flying low, machine guns ripping through densely packed vehicles and men. Soviet artillery shells them from positions that seem to be everywhere, and men abandon vehicles and flee into the forests, taking their chances with the cold and the partisans rather than staying on the killing ground of the roads. Thousands freeze to death during the retreat, and this is how it happens. They fall behind the column, exhausted, frostbitten, sick with dysentery or typhus, and they collapse in the snow. If their comrades try to help them, they both die. Both freeze, so they leave them. And this is what war reduces men to: the calculation that your friend must die so you might live. The roads west are lined with frozen corpses, hundreds of them, thousands, German soldiers who made it out of the battle only to die on their retreat, and they will lie there until spring when the snow melts and reveals the true cost. At Army Group Center headquarters, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock watches his front collapse in real time and sends increasingly desperate reports to Hitler, his messages growing more urgent with each passing hour. The 4th Panzer Group has been pushed back 100 kilometers in 5 days, he reports. The 9th Army is in full retreat with Soviet forces pursuing. The 2nd Panzer Army, Guderian's command, is being encircled south of Moscow and may be destroyed completely. Soviet forces have recaptured Klin, Kalinin, Istra, towns that cost thousands of German lives to take. They are driving toward Kaluga and Smolensk, threatening to cut off the entire army group from its supply lines. Bock requests permission for a general withdrawal to defensible positions 150 kilometers west to shorten the lines, consolidate what remains of his forces, survive the winter and resume operations in spring when the weather allows. This is military common sense. This is what any rational commander would order. Hitler's response arrives on December 16th with the force of a hammer. Stand fast, no retreat. Every position will be held, not one step back. The order is read with disbelief at field headquarters, officers staring at the paper as if the words might change if they look long enough. Hold what? German forces are scattered across hundreds of kilometers of Russian winter, disorganized, freezing, starving. Supply lines do not exist. They have been cut or abandoned. Units are surrounded on all sides, fighting in every direction. Men are freezing faster than they are dying in combat. Guderian, whose 2nd Panzer Army is being systematically destroyed piece by piece, requests permission to withdraw to the Oka River line 50 kilometers back, where defensive positions can be established and held. Hitler refuses with finality. Guderian flies to East Prussia on December 20th to argue in person, to make Hitler understand the reality of what is happening. But the meeting is brief and brutal. a conversation that ends careers. Guderian speaks first. My Führer, my men are dying of cold faster than they are dying in combat. We must withdraw to positions we can actually defend, or the army will be destroyed. We will lose everything. Hitler's response is ice. The army will hold its current positions. Withdrawal is forbidden. This discussion is over. Guderian tries again. Then the army will be destroyed in place. We will lose hundreds of thousands of men for nothing. History will judge this decision harshly. Hitler leans forward. Better destroyed in place than destroyed retreating. Better to die where you stand than to run like cowards. And I will not tolerate defeatism from my generals. The meeting ends. Guderian returns to the front in silence, knowing his career is over. On December 26th, he is relieved of command for continuing to argue for withdrawal, for refusing to send his men to pointless deaths, and he is not the only one. Field Marshal Walter von Brokich, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, suffers a heart attack on December 19th from stress, exhaustion, the weight of watching the Wehrmacht bleed out in the snow, while he is powerless to stop it. Hitler accepts his resignation, and on that day Hitler assumes personal command of the army, making himself not just the political leader, but the military commander of all German forces. Now Hitler is making tactical decisions from East Prussia about positions 1,500 kilometers away that he cannot see and does not understand, directing battles from a map while men die in the snow. But in a strange, terrible way that no one could have predicted, the Stand Fast order works not because it is militarily sound, which it is not, but because it prevents total collapse. German units that might have fled in panic, broken and run, dissolved into mobs of refugees, are forced to hold improvised positions, and they do, because the alternative is execution. They dig into villages, fortifying houses with furniture and frozen earth. They dig into forests, building shelters from logs and snow. They dig into anywhere that provides shelter from the wind that never stops, and they fight not to advance or even to win, but simply to survive until spring, and this becomes the new objective: survival. Soviet offensives driving deep into German positions create their own supply problems as they advance too far too fast. Soviet units outrun their logistics just as the Wehrmacht did in summer, and irony piles upon irony. Soviet tank spearheads run out of fuel 100 kilometers behind German lines and sit immobilized, vulnerable. Soviet infantry advances in -40-degree cold, suffering their own frostbite casualties, their own losses to the cold that kills regardless of nationality. The Soviet offensives slow, then stop, not because German defenses are strong, but because both sides are exhausted, bled white, unable to continue. By late December, the front stabilizes into a ragged line. The Wehrmacht has been pushed back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow, depending on the sector, losing in a month what it took months to gain. The closest they will ever get to the Soviet capital is now in the past, and Moscow will never again be within reach. The cost is catastrophic beyond anything Germany has experienced in living memory. Army Group Center's casualties in December alone exceed 160,000 men killed, wounded, missing, incapacitated by frostbite, gone from the order of battle. But that is just December, just 1 month, just one army group. Across the entire Eastern Front, by the end of 1941, Wehrmacht casualties exceed 830,000 men in just 6 months of operations. Approximately 250,000 are dead, killed in action, or died of wounds or frozen to death, their bodies scattered across 1,000 kilometers of Russian territory. Over 500,000 are wounded, many permanently disabled, missing limbs, blind, crippled, men who will never fight again, never work again, burdens on families and state. 50,000 plus are missing or captured, most of whom will never return, dying in Soviet captivity or executed as they surrender. Tens of thousands more are incapacitated by frostbite so severe they will never recover. Men who will spend the rest of their lives with stumps where hands and feet used to be. The 3.8 million men who crossed the Soviet border in June with songs and flags have been reduced by nearly 1 million casualties in 6 months, and this is the fastest rate of attrition any army has ever suffered. Equipment losses are equally devastating. representing years of production. 2,300 tanks destroyed or abandoned, over 60% of the invasion force, irreplaceable in the short term. Thousands of aircraft lost to combat, accidents, lack of spare parts, weather. Over 190,000 vehicles destroyed or inoperable, more than half of what began the campaign, and German industry cannot replace them. Over 180,000 horses dead, half the total, and the Wehrmacht's logistics depend on horses far more than on trucks. And when the horses die, the supplies stop moving. German formations are shells of their former strength, hollow organizations that exist on paper but not in reality. Divisions that began the campaign with 17,000 men now field 4,000 to 6,000 effective soldiers, and even those are exhausted, sick, frostbitten, barely combat capable. Some units have ceased to exist entirely, amalgamated with other shattered formations, their proud names stricken from the order of battle. And the Soviets, despite horrific losses that dwarf German casualties, over 4.4 million casualties in 1941, including millions of prisoners, are mobilizing more divisions with terrifying speed. Factories evacuated east beyond German reach, dismantled brick by brick, and reassembled beyond the Urals, are producing tanks, aircraft, artillery in quantities that German intelligence said were impossible. The war that was supposed to be over in 10 weeks has become a grinding war of attrition, a war of production and population, and Germany is losing this war with mathematical certainty because the Soviet Union is simply larger, has more people, more resources, more space to retreat into. In villages across the Reich, from Bavaria to the Baltic, the first letters arrive in late December and early January, and they all say the same thing in slightly different words. We regret to inform you that your son, husband, brother, father has fallen in the East, died in combat, died of wounds, missing in action, presumed dead. The German people were told the campaign was a success, that Moscow would fall any day, that the Bolshevik state was finished and victory was certain. Now the casualty lists are coming home in numbers that cannot be hidden, cannot be explained away, and the lie is exposed. Small towns that sent 200 men east in June received notices that 80 will not return, that they died in a country most Germans cannot find on a map, for objectives that no one can clearly explain. Families wait for letters that will never come, writing to sons who are already dead. The letters returned unopened. Women become widows at 25, at 30, at 20, their futures erased. Children become orphans, growing up without fathers, asking questions that mothers cannot answer. Parents bury sons when there is a body to bury. But most of the dead are still in Russia, frozen in snowdrifts, buried in mass graves, lying in fields and forests where they fell, and they will never come home, never receive proper burials, never be mourned at their own graves. The largest invasion in history has turned into the largest military disaster Germany has experienced since the 30 Years' War 3 centuries ago. And it is only the beginning, not the end. The Eastern Front will continue for another 3.5 years of unimaginable brutality. Stalingrad will come in 1942, Kursk in 1943, Operation Barbarossa in 1944, the slow-grinding Soviet advance that will end in Berlin in 1945, with Germany destroyed, occupied, divided. But the turning point is not Stalingrad in 1942, though that is what most people believe. The turning point is here, December 1941, when the Wehrmacht was stopped at the gates of Moscow and thrown back for the first time in its history. The myth of German invincibility died in the Russian winter, shot through the heart, and with it died any chance Germany had of winning the war, of achieving Hitler's vision of creating the 1,000-year Reich. Germany would fight on for 3 more years with increasing desperation, but the war was lost in those 6 months. Lost in the decisions made in Berlin in December 1940, lost in the assumptions that Soviet resistance would collapse, lost in the hubris that believed ideology could overcome logistics and could defeat geography. Here is what most people believe about Operation Barbarossa even today, the comfortable narrative that has been repeated so often it has become accepted truth. The Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union with the largest army ever assembled. They advanced successfully through summer and autumn, with victory seeming certain. Then winter arrived early and unusually harsh, brutal and unprecedented, and the German army, unprepared for the extreme cold, froze to death in the Russian snow. And if not for this unusually harsh winter, Germany would have won, Moscow would have fallen, the Soviet Union would have collapsed, and history would be different. This narrative is comfortable because it removes human responsibility, makes the disaster seem like an act of nature, an act of God, unavoidable, unforeseeable, tragic but blameless, and no one has to accept responsibility for the deaths of millions. It is also a lie told by German generals after the war to excuse their failure, to shift blame from their decisions to the weather, and a lie repeated so often by historians, textbooks, documentaries, that it became accepted history, the story everyone knows. The truth is harder, more damning, and far more important to understand because it still teaches us today. The winter did not defeat the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht defeated itself through decisions made by men who believe their own propaganda. Let us dismantle the myth piece by piece with facts that cannot be denied. Myth number 1. The winter of 1941 was unusually severe, a once-in-a-century event. Reality: it was a normal Russian winter, average in every measurable way. Meteorological records from 1941 to 42 show temperatures within normal ranges for the Moscow region, nothing exceptional, nothing unusual. November temperatures averaged around -15 degrees Celsius, December around -15 to -20, January 1942 ranging from -20 to -38 degrees. This was not unusual. This was not extreme by Russian standards. This was average, normal, expected, the same winter that comes every year. Moscow sees temperatures below -20 degrees every winter and has for centuries. This is not news to anyone who lives there. The countryside gets colder, temperatures drop further from the moderating effect of cities, and this too is normal and expected. This has been true for centuries, for as long as records exist. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, he faced similar temperatures in similar conditions, and his army was destroyed by the same winter that destroyed Hitler's army. When Charles V of Sweden invaded in 1708, the same happened. The same winter, the same destruction. The Russians knew what their winters were like. They had always known. This was their home, their country, their climate. The Germans should have known. The information was available. The history was clear. The pattern was obvious. The Wehrmacht experienced the cold as catastrophic, not because it was unusual, but because German soldiers had never experienced a continental winter. Most came from temperate Western Europe, from France, the Rhineland, Bavaria, where winter means 0 to 5 degrees Celsius and rain, not -30 degrees and weeks of darkness. For Russians, this was normal life. This was every winter. This was what they dressed for and prepared for from childhood. For Siberians, this was mild, barely worth mentioning, warmer than home. The difference was not the weather, which was completely normal. The difference was preparation, adaptation, experience, and fighting on home ground, where you understand the conditions. Myth number 2, the Germans were caught by surprise. Winter came early. No one could have predicted it. Reality: winter came exactly on schedule, precisely when it always comes. But the campaign started late and ran long, and this was entirely predictable. The original plan called for invasion on May 15, 1941, and this date was chosen carefully to give the Wehrmacht 5 months of good weather, May through September, to destroy the Red Army and take Moscow before autumn turned the roads to mud. 5 months was the absolute minimum the operation required. Everyone knew this. The planners calculated it precisely. But the Balkans campaign in April delayed the start to June 22nd, and that cost 5 critical weeks, 5 weeks that pushed the timeline toward winter. Then the Kiev decision in August cost another 5 weeks, while Army Group Center's panzers were diverted south to encircle Soviet forces that could have been dealt with later. Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, did not begin until October 2nd, and this was 4.5 months after the invasion started, not 2 months. The plan said Moscow would fall by late August. In reality, German forces did not even begin the final assault until October, 2 months late. This was not winter arriving early. This was the campaign running catastrophically behind schedule, behind the timeline that was required for success. Every decision that delayed the advance, the Balkans operation, the Kiev encirclement, the 2-month battle at Smolensk that took far longer than expected, all of these pushed the timeline closer to winter, ate up the operational margin, narrowed the window until it closed completely. And every German planner knew winter was coming. They had calendars, they had meteorological data, they had history books. They knew that Russian winter arrives in November and that armies cannot operate effectively in Russian winter without preparation. They gambled that they would win before winter arrived. They bet everything on speed and shock, and they lost the gamble. That is not surprise, that is calculated risk that went wrong. Myth number 3, if Germany had issued winter clothing and equipment, they would have won. The lack of preparation was the critical failure. Reality, winter clothing would not have fixed the fundamental problems that were killing the Wehrmacht. Yes, the lack of winter equipment was a catastrophic oversight that killed thousands of men unnecessarily, and thousands more were incapacitated by frostbite that proper clothing would have prevented. And this is criminal negligence by any measure. But the Wehrmacht's problems went far deeper than uniforms and ran to the core of the entire operation. The logistics system had collapsed by midsummer, long before winter, long before the cold became a factor. German supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers from railheads to the front, and this distance was simply too great to sustain operations. Soviet railways used a different gauge than European railways, a wider spacing between tracks, and this forced the transfer of all supplies at the border. Every single item had to be unloaded and reloaded, and this created bottlenecks that slowed everything. Roads were primitive dirt tracks that turned to mud after summer rain. Not winter snow, but summer rain, and trucks bogged down in summer. Traffic jams formed in summer. Supplies failed to reach the front in summer. The Wehrmacht needed to move 900 tons of supplies per day just to maintain basic operations for Army Group Center alone, and by November they were moving less than half that. But the problems started in August when they were only moving 60%. Fuel did not reach the panzers in summer, ammunition did not reach the artillery in summer, food did not reach the infantry in summer. Winter clothing, even if it had been issued in unlimited quantities, would not have solved the fact that there was no logistical infrastructure capable of sustaining 3.8 million men, 1,000 kilometers in enemy territory across primitive roads with inadequate rail capacity. The plan required the war to be over before logistics became a critical problem, required victory in 8 to 10 weeks maximum, and when the war was not over, when victory did not come, the system collapsed because it was never designed to sustain a long campaign. Winter just made the failure visible and undeniable. Myth number 4, the Wehrmacht was winning until winter stopped them. Victory was within grasp. Reality, the Wehrmacht was losing by August, 3 months before winter, 3 months before the cold became a factor, and the numbers prove it beyond doubt. By the end of August 1941, still summer, with temperatures in the 20s Celsius, comfortable weather, the Wehrmacht had suffered over 440,000 casualties, nearly 500,000 men lost. That is before the mud, before the cold, before the battle for Moscow, before winter entered the equation at all. Over 400,000 men lost in 10 weeks, not from freezing, but from combat, disease, exhaustion, and the sheer grinding attrition of fighting an enemy that would not quit, that kept fighting when by all logic they should have surrendered. German armored strength had declined by 50% due to mechanical breakdowns, not combat losses, and this is critical to understand. Breakdowns from operating on terrible roads across vast distances, transmissions failing, engines overheating, tracks breaking, all in summer weather. The invasion began with 3,600 tanks. By September, fewer than 2,800 were operational, and half the tank losses were mechanical failure, not Soviet action. Horses, the backbone of Wehrmacht logistics that no one likes to talk about, were dying by the thousands from overwork and lack of fodder, and these deaths happened in summer. By autumn, over 100,000 horses were dead, and summer heat and overwork killed them, not winter cold. The Red Army, despite losing millions of men, millions of prisoners taken in the Great Encirclements, was still forming new divisions with astonishing speed, pulling men from the interior, mobilizing reserves, and German intelligence had said this was impossible, that the Soviets had no reserves, that the regime was fragile and would collapse. Soviet factories were being evacuated east beyond German reach, dismantled and loaded onto trains, and reassembled beyond the Urals where German aircraft could not reach them, and continuing production without pause. And this happened in summer and autumn. The campaign was already failing before the first snow fell. The attrition was unsustainable. The advance was slowing. The logistics were collapsing, and winter did not create the crisis. Winter revealed it, made it impossible to hide or deny. The real reasons Barbarossa failed, the truth that is harder to accept but must be understood. First, the logistics were impossible from day one, mathematically impossible, and everyone who looked at the numbers should have known this. An army of 3.8 million men cannot be sustained 1,000 kilometers from a supply base across territory with primitive infrastructure. This violates basic principles of military logistics that have been understood for centuries. The math never worked, the supply requirements exceeded the transportation capacity by a factor of 2 or more, and German quartermasters knew it, they calculated it, they presented the numbers, but they were told victory would come so quickly it would not matter, that the campaign would be over before logistics became critical. It mattered and they were wrong. Second, the timeline was fantasy from the beginning. Pure wishful thinking. 8 to 10 weeks to destroy the Red Army and occupy European Russia was never achievable, never realistic, and was based on nothing but hope and ideology. It was based on the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse like France, quick and decisive and total. But the Soviet Union was not France, it was deeper, larger, more populous, more resilient. Soviet forces could retreat 500 kilometers and still have strategic depth, still have room to maneuver, still have space to trade for time. France could not do this. France had no depth. When France's armies were broken, the country was finished. The assumption of quick collapse was ideology masquerading as strategy, belief masquerading as analysis, and it was wrong from day one. Third, the enemy was catastrophically underestimated at every level. Every German intelligence assessment was wrong, not slightly wrong, but fundamentally wrong, and this should have been a warning. Soviet tank production was not inferior, it was superior, and by 1941 the T-34 was superior to any German tank in armor, mobility, and firepower, and German tankers knew this within days of encountering them. Soviet industrial capacity was not limited. The USSR outproduced Germany in tanks and aircraft throughout the entire war, and this was predictable from factory capacity and raw material access. Soviet will to resist was not weak. When faced with a war of extermination, the Soviet population fought with desperation, with courage born of having no choice, because surrender meant death. German intelligence saw what ideology told them to see. They found evidence that confirmed their prejudices and ignored evidence that contradicted them. Slavs were inferior. This was Nazi doctrine. Therefore, Soviet soldiers would not fight well. Communism was fragile. This was Nazi belief. Therefore, the Soviet state would collapse under pressure. Victory was inevitable. This was Nazi faith. Therefore, all evidence must support inevitable victory. Reality disagreed, but reality was not consulted. And this is how empires fall. Fourth, the ideology was toxic and guaranteed failure. This was not a conventional war. This was a race war, an ideological war of annihilation, and this changed everything. Wehrmacht orders called for the execution of Soviet commissars, political officers to be shot on sight, the abuse of prisoners of war. Soviet prisoners were not protected by Geneva Conventions in German thinking. They were subhuman and could be worked to death. The destruction of Jewish Bolshevism, which meant the murder of Jewish populations in occupied territories. Entire villages were burned, civilians were massacred, and this happened systematically, as policy, not as isolated incidents. Ukrainians and Belarusians, who might have welcomed the Germans as liberators from Stalin's brutal regime, Instead encountered Einsatzgruppen, death squads, and starvation policies designed to clear the land for German settlers. Potential allies became partisans, became enemies, became fighters who attacked German supply lines and killed German soldiers. Soviet soldiers, knowing they faced execution or death by starvation if captured, knowing that 3.3 million Soviet POWs would die in German custody from deliberate starvation and abuse, fought to the death rather than surrender. The ideology guaranteed the war would be total and merciless, and this benefited the defender who fought on his own soil, not the attacker whose supply lines stretched across hostile territory. Fifth, winter was context, not cause, the stage on which failure played out, but not the reason for failure. Yes, winter killed tens of thousands of German soldiers through cold and frostbite. Yes, equipment failed in temperatures it was not designed for. Yes, the Wehrmacht was unprepared and suffered accordingly. But Soviet soldiers and equipment functioned in the same winter, the same temperatures, the same conditions. T-34 tanks moved when German panzers were frozen. Siberian divisions fought when German divisions huddled for warmth. The Red Army counterattacked while German forces froze. The difference was preparation, adaptation, and fighting on home ground. Winter did not defeat Germany. Germany defeated itself by launching an unwinnable campaign based on ideology rather than analysis, continuing it past the point of viability, refusing to adapt when reality contradicted the plan, and believing until the end that will and superior technology could overcome logistics and geography. This is the pattern, and this is what we must understand. Stop here for a moment and think about how many times you have seen this pattern repeated throughout history, in different countries, in different wars, in different contexts. Leaders who believe ideology over evidence, who surround themselves with yes men who tell them what they want to hear. Militaries convinced that will and superior technology can overcome logistics and geography, that spirit can defeat mathematics. Campaigns launched on assumptions that are never tested against reality, never questioned, never examined critically. Enemies underestimated because they are viewed through contempt rather than analysis, because ideology says they are inferior. Vietnam, where American leaders believed superior firepower would break Vietnamese will, ignoring the fact that the Vietnamese were fighting for their homeland. Soviet Afghanistan, where Soviet leaders believed they could impose communism by force, ignoring centuries of Afghan resistance to foreign occupation. American Afghanistan, where American leaders believed they could build a nation in their image, ignoring the complexity of tribal politics and the history of foreign failure. Iraq, where American leaders believed they would be welcomed as liberators, ignoring sectarian divisions and regional politics. The specifics change, the names change, the dates change, but the pattern holds with depressing consistency. When you ignore logistics, underestimate your enemy, and believe your own propaganda, people die, not hundreds but hundreds of thousands, not quickly but slowly in grinding attrition that destroys armies and nations. The 830,000 Wehrmacht casualties by the end of 1941 did not die because of weather that was unusual or unpredictable. They died because of decisions made by leaders who could not accept that reality does not bend to ideology, who believed that wanting victory badly enough would make it happen, who sent millions of men into an impossible campaign because admitting it was impossible would have meant admitting their entire worldview was wrong. And they are still teaching us, these 830,000 dead, if we are willing to listen, if we are willing to learn from their deaths rather than repeat the mistakes that killed them. The failure at Moscow in December 1941 did not end the war. It guaranteed Germany could not win it, sealed Germany's fate with absolute certainty. Everything that came after, 3.5 more years of fighting, millions more dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, the Holocaust accelerating as Germany's military position deteriorated, all of it was consequence flowing from those first 6 months, from the decisions made in December 1940, from the ideology that said the Soviet Union would collapse because it must collapse. The moment the Wehrmacht failed to take Moscow before winter, the strategic equation changed permanently and irreversibly. Germany was now fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with more men, more resources, and more territory than it could ever match. And wars of attrition are won by the side with more resources. This is mathematical certainty. But Hitler could not accept this, would not accept it. His ideology would not permit acceptance of this reality. So the killing continued, the war ground on, and millions more died. 1942 brought the drive for oil, the push into the Caucasus. By spring 1942, the Wehrmacht had rebuilt, barely, like a body healing from terrible wounds. Divisions shattered in the winter were refilled with new conscripts, boys and older men, the quality declining as the best were already dead. Equipment losses were replaced, though never fully. Production could not keep pace with losses. The Eastern Front stabilized along a line running from Leningrad in the north through Moscow's outskirts down to Rostov in the south, a front of over 1,000 kilometers. German casualties from the entire 1941 campaign exceeded 830,000 men, over 1 million if you include sick and permanently disabled who would never fight again. Soviet casualties exceeded 4.4 million killed, captured, wounded, missing, a number so large it seems abstract, impossible to comprehend. By every metric, the Soviets had suffered worse, lost more men, lost more territory, lost more equipment, but they were still fighting, still mobilizing, still producing, and this was what German planning had said was impossible. Hitler planned a new offensive for summer 1942, Case Blue, and this time the objective was not Moscow but the Caucasus, the oil fields at Baku that fueled the Soviet war machine. The logic was clear. Capture the oil and the Red Army grinds to a halt. Tanks stop, trucks stop, aircraft stop, everything stops without fuel. The offensive began in June with initial success. German forces drove deep into southern Russia with the speed and skill that had characterized the early months of Barbarossa. Reaching the Caucasus Mountains by August, getting tantalizingly close to the oil fields. But Hitler made the same mistake again, the same pattern repeating, divided objectives that split forces and diluted strength. He ordered the Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, to capture the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, and this order was given not for strategic reasons, but for symbolic ones, psychological ones. The city bore Stalin's name. Taking it would be a propaganda victory, a blow to Soviet morale, a demonstration of German power. Paulus's Sixth Army reached Stalingrad in August and entered the city in September, expecting to take it quickly. But the battle became hell on earth, urban combat, house to house, room to room, floor to floor, fighting for every building, every street, every pile of rubble. Soviet defenders, commanded by General Vasily Chukov, contested every meter with ferocious determination, refusing to yield, trading space for time and blood for survival. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, rat war, fighting in the sewers and bombed-out factories, in the wreckage of apartment buildings where walls provided no cover and every window held a sniper. A war of snipers and grenades, a war where combatants were so close they could hear each other breathing through walls, where the front line ran through individual rooms. The Sixth Army bled itself out, taking 90% of the city, losing men every day, every hour, grinding forward meter by meter. By November, Paulus reported his army was exhausted, out of ammunition, out of food, out of hope, and needed to withdraw, to regroup, to survive. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets answered with Operation Uranus. Two massive pincer attacks struck north and south of Stalingrad simultaneously, smashing through Romanian and Italian forces protecting the German flanks. And these Allied armies collapsed within days, unable to withstand the assault. On November 23, just 4 days after the offensive began, the pincers met west of the city in a moment that sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands. The entire Sixth Army, 290,000 men, was encircled, trapped in Stalingrad, with Soviet forces surrounding them on all sides. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold, to fight in place, no retreat, no surrender, and Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring promised to supply the army by air. 500 tons per day, enough to keep them alive, enough to keep them fighting. The Luftwaffe delivered less than 100 tons per day on average, and even this required heroic efforts by pilots flying through terrible weather and Soviet anti-aircraft fire. It was not enough, nowhere near enough, and everyone except Hitler knew it was not enough. Through December and January, the Sixth Army slowly starved and froze inside the Stalingrad pocket, suffering the same winter that had devastated the Wehrmacht a year before. Soviet forces tightened the noose methodically, reducing the pocket, capturing airfields, cutting supply lines. German relief attempts failed. Panzer columns driving from the west got within 50 kilometers before being stopped and driven back. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered, and this was unprecedented, shocking, a moment that changed how Germans saw the war. Hitler had promoted him to field marshal the day before, and everyone understood the message. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in history. The honor of the rank demanded death before surrender. The implication was clear and brutal. Paulus was expected to commit suicide rather than surrender. Paulus surrendered anyway, choosing life over honor, choosing his men over ideology. Of the 290,000 men trapped at Stalingrad, only 6,000 returned to Germany after the war. Years later, broken men who had survived Soviet labor camps. The rest died in the pocket from starvation, cold, disease, combat, or died in Soviet captivity, buried in mass graves, their families never knowing exactly when or how they died. Stalingrad was the first time an entire German army had been destroyed, erased from existence, and the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, already cracked at Moscow, shattered completely into pieces that could never be reassembled. 1943 brought the last offensive, Germany's last attempt to regain the initiative. Summer 1943, Operation Citadel, a massive pincer attack against a Soviet salient bulging into German lines near the city of Kursk. If successful, it would encircle over 500,000 Soviet troops and potentially regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, restore German prestige, buy time for new weapons to arrive. The Wehrmacht assembled the largest armored force it had ever fielded, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and these included new models that were supposed to be war winners. Panther tanks with powerful guns and sloped armor, Tiger tanks nearly invulnerable to Soviet anti-tank weapons, Ferdinand tank destroyers with 80mm guns, the best equipment German industry could produce, technological marvels. The attack began July 5, 1943, and the Soviets were waiting because they knew it was coming. Soviet intelligence, warned by the British who had broken German codes, knew exactly when and where the attack would come, knew the German order of battle, knew the objectives. The Red Army dug in with thoroughness that would have impressed German engineers. 8 defensive lines stretching back 150 kilometers in depth, minefields with over 1 million mines, anti-tank ditches wide enough to stop Tigers, concealed anti-tank guns positioned for perfect fields of fire, artillery pre-sighted on likely German approach routes. The Battle of Kursk lasted 2 weeks of the most intense armored combat in history. At Prokhorovka on July 12th, over 800 tanks fought in a single engagement across 30 square kilometers, and the battlefield became a slaughterhouse of burning armor, smoke so thick it blocked the sun, tanks exploding, men burning, the ground torn by shells until it looked like the surface of the moon. By July 13th, the German offensive had stalled completely. Gains were measured in kilometers, 5 here, 10 there, nothing decisive, nothing that justified the losses. Losses were measured in hundreds of irreplaceable tanks, thousands of irreplaceable trained crews, the core of German armored strength destroyed. Hitler called off the offensive on July 13th, admitting defeat, accepting that the attack had failed. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht had launched a major offensive with clear objectives and failed to achieve a breakthrough, failed to encircle Soviet forces, failed to change the strategic situation. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviets on that day, and Germany would never attack again on this scale, would never again mass its armor for a great offensive, would spend the rest of the war retreating, defending, dying slowly. From Kursk onward, Germany was retreating, and the retreat would not stop until Berlin burned. 1944 and 1945 brought the long retreat, the slow collapse. Soviet offensives in 1944 drove the Wehrmacht out of the Soviet Union entirely, liberating Soviet territory that had been occupied for years. Operation Barbarossa in June 1944, timed to coincide with D-Day in the West to split German attention, destroyed German Army Group Center in 5 weeks of devastating combat. 28 German divisions ceased to exist, erased from the order of battle, over 450,000 German casualties, and this was worse than Stalingrad in scale, though less famous. Soviet forces liberated Belarusia, the Baltic states, Poland, driving west with momentum that seemed unstoppable. By January 1945, the Red Army was on German soil, crossing the border, bringing the war home to Germany with terrible vengeance. The advance toward Berlin was brutal, characterized by atrocities on both sides, the accumulated rage and hatred of 4 years of total war. Soviet soldiers, remembering what the Wehrmacht had done to their country, the villages burned, the civilians murdered, the prisoners starved, showed little mercy, and accounts of what happened in eastern Germany are too terrible to describe in detail. German civilians fled west by the millions ahead of the Soviet advance, abandoning homes, taking only what they could carry, dying on the roads from cold and starvation and Soviet attacks. By April 1945, Soviet forces surrounded Berlin, and the great city that had been the heart of the Reich became a battlefield. Hitler in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, surrounded by maps and dreams, issued orders to armies that no longer existed, directed counter-offensives by divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier, blamed his generals for losing a war he had made unwinnable through his decisions. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces blocks away, close enough to hear, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, shooting himself while his staff prepared his body for burning. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, and the war in Europe was over after 6 years of destruction. The cost of the Eastern Front, the price paid in blood and suffering, the deadliest theater of the deadliest war in human history, numbers so large they lose meaning. German casualties on the Eastern Front exceeded 4 million military deaths, another 1 million missing or captured who never returned, dead in Soviet camps or executed during capture. That is 80% of all German military deaths in World War II. 4 out of every 5 German soldiers who died fighting the Soviet Union. Soviet casualties, 8.7 million military deaths, soldiers who died in uniform fighting for their country. 18 million civilian deaths, maybe more. The number will never be known exactly. Civilians who died from German actions, starvation, disease, cold, murdered in villages, worked to death, died in siege. Read that number again and try to comprehend it. 27 million Soviet citizens died, military and civilian combined. That is the entire population of modern-day Australia, gone, erased, dead in 4 years. Entire cities were erased from the map. Leningrad lost 1/3 of its population to starvation during the siege that lasted 872 days. Kiev, Minsk, Stalingrad were reduced to ruins, buildings collapsed, infrastructure destroyed, nothing remaining but rubble. Over 1,600 Soviet towns and 70,000 villages were destroyed completely, burned, demolished, wiped from existence. The demographic impact was catastrophic and would affect the Soviet Union for generations. The Soviet Union lost an entire generation of men, and in some regions the ratio of women to men after the war was 3-to-1, 3 women for every surviving man. Millions of children grew up without fathers, an entire generation of orphans. Families ceased to exist, bloodlines ended, and the psychological scars would never fully heal. And it all began with the decisions made in Berlin in December 1940, with the belief that ideology could overcome logistics, that will could defeat geography, that the enemy would break because German racial theories said they must break. And when reality contradicted theory, reality was ignored until it could no longer be ignored. 830,000 Wehrmacht casualties in the first 6 months, and 4 million more in the 3.5 years that followed. All of it, every death, every ruined city, every shattered family, every broken life, consequence flowing from a plan that was doomed before the first shot was fired. Doomed by hubris, by ideology, by the arrogance of men who believed they could reshape the world through will alone. What it means today, what we must understand, The bones are still being found across Eastern Europe. Construction crews in Russia, Belarus, Poland, the Baltic states uncover mass graves with horrifying regularity. Every year, new discoveries. German helmets corroded into rust after 80 years in the earth. Soviet rifles still loaded, never fired, held by skeletons. Identification tags that let families finally learn what happened to sons and brothers who vanished in 1941 and never came home. Never sent another letter, disappeared into the vast emptiness of war. Museums across Europe preserve letters found on bodies, messages from the dead. A Wehrmacht soldier writing to his mother that he cannot feel his feet anymore, that the cold has taken his toes, that he does not think he will survive. A Soviet conscript telling his family he is being sent to the front without a rifle, told to pick one up from the dead, writing goodbye because he knows what this means. A German officer's diary admitting that what they are doing to civilians is monstrous, criminal, evil, but he follows orders anyway, because what else can he do? And this question haunts his final entries. These were not statistics in a history book. These were not numbers on casualty reports. These were human beings with names and faces and families. The 830,000 Wehrmacht casualties by the end of 1941 were sons who wrote letters home, promising they would be back by Christmas, young men who believed the propaganda, who trusted their leaders, who died far from home in a country they did not understand for objectives no one could explain. Husbands who kissed their wives goodbye at train stations in June 1941 with promises to write every week, and the letters came for a while and then stopped. And the wives waited and the letters never came again. Fathers whose children waited for them, asked when daddy would come home, and the mothers had no answer because they did not know if daddy was alive or dead, prisoner or frozen in some Russian field. The 4.4 million Soviet casualties in 1941 were farmers pulled from fields they had worked their entire lives, given rifles and uniforms, and sent to fight with days of training. Factory workers conscripted with no military experience, told to march toward the sound of guns. Teenagers who lied about their age to fight for their homeland. Boys of 16 claiming to be 18, dying before they turned 17. Women who served as pilots and snipers and tank drivers, fighting alongside men, dying alongside men, buried in the same mass graves. All of them dead or broken because leaders chose ideology over reality, because they ignored logistics, underestimated their enemy, and believed their own propaganda. And this is the lesson we must learn if their deaths are to mean anything. Not the comfortable lie that Germany lost because of winter, but the hard truth that wars built on ideology rather than strategy are doomed from the start. Leaders who believe their own propaganda destroy the people who trust them, who follow their orders, who die implementing their visions. Campaigns launched without logistics, without realistic timelines, without understanding the enemy, fail, and the human cost is incalculable, measured in millions. And the pattern repeats because we keep telling ourselves comfortable lies instead of hard truths. Because we want simple explanations that do not challenge us. Because accepting responsibility is harder than blaming the weather or bad luck or circumstances beyond control. We say Germany lost because of winter, not because the plan was impossible from day one. We say the Wehrmacht was defeated by superior numbers, not because they launched a war of annihilation that turned